Dr. Mark forward to you. Thank you. I'm pretty dry. I'm just getting over a cold, so I'll be drinking water off and on throughout this lecture. I want to thank you all for coming this morning and to congratulate you on your good sense for living in such a beautiful part of the country. It's a real pleasure for me to have this opportunity to come up here and to speak to you. It's been especially enjoyable for me to have this opportunity to come up here because I grew up in Portland and sometimes came up here during the summer as a boy. My grandparents owned a cabin over on the eastern side of Coeur d'Alene Lake. And as a child, you see things in one way, and it's nice now to have this opportunity to come back and look at some of the same things and see them with a new perspective, and also to see all the new developments that have gone on up here in the Coeur d'Alene area. I have one final thing I'd like to do before I start my lecture, and that is this. I've been here since Saturday. I had to come in early, and I've had an opportunity to meet a fair number of the faculty and staff and administration at the school here and see something of the facilities. I've used some of your microcomputers yesterday, and I've seen your TV studio and various other facilities here. And I just want to tell you how impressed I am with your school, especially your faculty, but also your facilities. I think that sometimes people who don't get around much or who are too close to a situation don't always appreciate the resources that they have available to them in their own local area. And I'd just like to tell you that I get around some, and I'm really impressed with especially the faculty, their knowledge and their commitment to teaching, and I hope you all recognize this and take every opportunity that you can to avail yourself of these wonderful resources. The title of my lecture is called Search for Meaning, and subtitled Health as a Means to an End. My thesis is that we've given too much attention to how to be healthy and too little attention to why be healthy. Moreover, because we've not given sufficient attention to why be healthy, we don't know how much of our resources, both private and public, to commit to achieving good health. Unless we can get some handle on why be healthy or the value of health, we'll have no way of knowing how much is enough. Put differently, I think the time has come to put good health in a wider context, a context that's both social and religious. The ultimate significance of health cannot be determined apart from this wider perspective, and it's this perspective which I think has been lost in recent times. Such is my thesis. The actual structure of my talk is this, that first I'll make some brief introductory remarks, and then I'll speak about life, what is it, then of value, and then of God and certain practical, medical sorts of issues, and finally of meaning in general. And I'll try to summarize my main points at various places as I go through here. What's good about good health? Is it good for something or is it good for nothing? There are many people who can tell us what we must do to be healthy, and who can even do things to us to make us healthy. But why be healthy? What's good about good health? If we can answer this question, we'll be in a better position to answer other questions such as how much of our personal time and resources ought to be devoted to health, and how much of our national resources are appropriately designated for health services. And when, if ever, is health no longer something to be sought? These are questions we must all answer sooner or later, straightforwardly or obliquely, consciously or unconsciously, and they're questions to which I'll return later in this lecture. What good is good health? The obvious answer to this perhaps strange question is that life is good, and that good health is simply being alive and well. This response is helpful, for it gets us back to even more basic terms, life and value. If we can determine what we mean by life, what constitutes value, and why life is valuable, we will be able to say what's good about good health, and then have some basis for answering the less ultimate but more pressing questions mentioned above. How much of our personal and national resources ought to be directed toward good health, and when, if ever, is good health not desirable? I think that too much of the discussion right now that we label medical ethics or the discussion concerning national health care and things like that is in some ways premature, that the more basic philosophical and religious questions about the meaning of life and the nature of life and value and things like that haven't been specifically addressed. And so without addressing those things, we leap right to these more special topics and have a real difficult time trying to answer them. The question, what is life, is one that's long been asked by philosophers and theologians, and more recently by biologists. The right answer to this question, and I believe that finally there is a right answer, is surely complex. For my purposes this morning, however, it will be sufficient simply to put forth what I believe to be the chief characteristic of life, namely the ability to experience. This abbreviated definition of life, the ability to experience, certainly seems true of human life and accords well with what we know of canine life and feline life and equine life and bovine life. And though we have less direct evidence in these matters, probably characterizes plant life and even the life of a single cell. To say that even a single cell experiences sounds a bit odd, perhaps because we have so few opportunities to observe individual cells, and perhaps because they are so different from us multicelled animals. But merely because something strikes us as a bit odd doesn't mean it isn't true. Those who have had an opportunity to watch a paramecium or an amoeba under a microscope for even a few moments have observed it interacting with its environment just as surely as a dog interacts with its environment. Indeed, I think it was the great biologist Haldane who once said that if an amoeba were as big as a dog, nobody would doubt that it has feelings. As for being very different from us, why should that be decisive? The fact that a single-cell organism lacks lungs doesn't mean it doesn't oxygenate itself, nor does the fact that they lack a stomach mean that they're incapable of digesting food. Why then should their lack of a nervous system argue against their ability to feel? I believe that they can feel. I believe that all living things can experience, and that's what it means to be alive, to experience. This definition of life, to be able to experience, also fits well with some of our basic uses of language. For example, people who engage in dangerous activities such as race car driving and mountain climbing sometimes explain their desire to do these things by saying it makes them feel more alive. If, as I'm suggesting, to live is to experience, then what they are saying is that in these precarious situations, their senses are more keenly attuned, and this heightened sense of awareness is what they're calling being more alive. I don't mean to suggest that these people are entirely correct, that one is somehow more alive when one places oneself in dangerous situations. In some respects, I disagree. My point is only that people do equate life with experience and natural language. My qualified disagreement with these people who associate danger and life is this. Intensity is only one criteria for evaluating experience. There is also depth of experience and breadth of experience. The thrills associated with dangerous activities often compromise both depth and breadth in favor of intensity. The experiences one associates with the birth of a child, or the death of a loved one, or the mastering of some hitherto impossible skill, such as riding a bike or solving a quadratic equation, or the experiences associated with helping someone gain a better understanding and appreciation for themselves. These experiences, I take it, are no less signs of life than driving fast. Indeed, I would argue that these experiences, characterized by their depth and breadth of feeling, are more truly characteristic of human life than are the more intense experiences we sometimes call really living. My first general point then is this: life is experiencing. There's no experience apart from life, and there's no life apart from experience. What about value? What do we mean by value, and what do we mean when we say life is valuable? One important distinction that needs to be made when discussing value is that between instrumental value and intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is the value something has in and for itself. The pleasure associated with reading a good book, or enjoying a friend's company, or walking alone in the woods is intrinsically valuable. The value of these experiences do not depend upon what follows from them, their use. They are valuable in themselves. I hold that all experience, all life, has some intrinsic value. This is in part what we mean when we say life is valuable. It's intrinsically valuable. Things which are not alive have no intrinsic value. If they have any value at all, it is of the instrumental type. A piece of gold, a hammer, or an atlas have no intrinsic value because they have no experience. They're not alive. But they do have instrumental value in that they can and do enhance the value of our experience. This distinction between those things, such as hammers and atlases, which are of instrumental value, and those things that experience, that have intrinsic value, is not quite so clear-cut. For experience also has instrumental value. The distinction then between instrumental value and intrinsic value is this: all things, including experience, including life, are of instrumental value, but only experience, only life, is of intrinsic value. Let me provide two examples of this somewhat abstractly formulated notion here. One example that comes readily to mind is the enjoyment I get when I read to my son. The experience is, he's 3 years old. The experience is intrinsically valuable. I really enjoy it, but it also has some instrumental value. It helps him go to sleep. It may help him learn to read, and it bonds us closer together. Another example of how a moment of human experience has both intrinsic and instrumental value is when we learn a skill. The learning itself is often enjoyable, and hence intrinsically valuable. But having learned the skill enables us to do certain things that we value that were previously impossible for us to accomplish. So learning the skill is both intrinsically valuable, it's also instrumentally valuable. These two examples, a father reading to his son and a person acquiring a skill, let's say a young woman learning to drive, are not atypical. Indeed, they are typical of all experience, if I'm correct. All experiences are both intrinsically valuable in themselves, and instrumentally valuable in that they contribute value to others, ourselves included. This is not to say that all experiences are of equal intrinsic or instrumental value. Some experiences are more valuable than others, both intrinsically and instrumentally. But all experience is valuable both in itself and in its ability to contribute value to other experiences. If experience, life, is both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, then the same can be said of human health. To a greater or lesser extent, human health is both intrinsically valuable in itself and instrumentally valuable because it enables an individual to pursue other valuable activities. This is one of the main points I wish to make in this lecture. All too often, it seems, especially in the last 20 years, and perhaps especially in regards to elderly people, the instrumental value of health has been overlooked. Physicians and nurses, physicians perhaps more than nurses, seek to heal us, and we seek to be healed for no other reason than that health is intrinsically valuable and because it is technically feasible. I'm not suggesting that health be seen only in terms of its instrumental value, but I will suggest that health is primarily of instrumental value. Health is valuable in itself, to be sure, but it's primarily valuable as a means to other ends. It is this aspect of health as a means to an end, that I wish to devote the remainder of the lecture. For it's this aspect of health that I believe has received too little attention. It's pertinent to add at this point that my view of instrumentalism, or the perspective that focuses on the instrumental value of health, differs from classical utilitarian thinking in that I believe that we can and do contribute to non-human life as well as human life, and more importantly, that we can and do contribute to the divine life. The modern world tends towards secularism and humanism, and hence instrumental value is often equated with how something contributes to the well-being of other humans or society as a whole. From my perspective, a perspective I acquired from and shared with people such as Martin Buber and Charles Hartshorne and John Cobb and others, the only lasting contribution that any of us can make are those contributions we make to God, for God alone is everlasting. The inclusion of God into a discussion of values is no small addition, and I will return to this topic shortly. But for the time being, I will proceed as if God were not a factor, for I think that there's some usefulness in considering this approach, even if one does not include God. The instrumental value of our health changes over time. When we are young, we can reasonably expect to live 60 or 70 or 80 years, and since our health ought to be of some great importance to us, often it should be more important to us than it is when we're young. For much of what we might later accomplish will depend upon our being healthy. As we grow older, however, the instrumental value of health decreases. An operation that costs $40,000 might be a perfectly rational investment for a young woman of 30 who can reasonably expect to live another 40 or 50 years. But it makes considerably less sense instrumentally conceived for a man of 80. If one sees health only in terms of its intrinsic value, the value it has for the individual, then no such distinction can be made. For it is just as valuable for person X age 30 to be well as it is for person Y age 80. But if health is also and primarily of instrumental value, as well as something that's valuable in itself, the balance tips heavily in favor of person X, age 30. This may sound heartless put in these terms, but in fact we tend to manage other aspects of our lives along very similar lines. Young people often make long-term investments with themselves as the beneficiary. Older people seldom do. Age, of course, is not the only relevant factor. The health of a parent of 4 young children is instrumentally conceived extremely valuable because others depend upon it. And the health of a middle-aged man with a great talent as a teacher is also instrumentally very valuable, again, because of what it has to contribute to the lives of others. In general, one's instrumental value is a function of 2 considerations: how many people benefit from one's actions, and how profoundly do they benefit. This section of my lecture has been rather long. My main points are these: that there are 2 types of value, intrinsic value and instrumental value, that experience and hence health is valuable in both respects, but primarily in terms of its instrumental value, and that instrumental value must be analyzed in terms of how much one contributes to others and to how many. I have also mentioned, but did not elaborate, on the fact that my heavily instrumental approach to health includes the notion that God profits from all experience, and so finally all intrinsic value is instrumental to God. I'll say more of this later. There are, however, a few more things I'd like to say about health instrumentally conceived before including God in the discussion directly. Looking at the instrumental value of health is rather sobering, for it requires us to pass judgments on ourselves and on others. Instrumentally conceived, not everyone's health is of equal value. It's more important that some be well or are made well than others. Instrumentally, it might be more important to provide medical assistance to person A rather than person B, even if person B is me or someone I love. For some, looking at the instrumental value of health is even more than sobering. It's frightening. It's frightening because humans are liable to make mistakes. What if somebody's more instrumentally valuable than we thought? And because it seems arbitrary. Who's to say what is and is not valuable? Doesn't this sort of perspective invite abuses? Wouldn't it permit who's ever in charge to withhold medical assistance to the old or the handicapped or Jews or Hispanics or white males or poor or whoever one considers to be less valuable? These concerns, though real, I don't find convincing. As for the matter of human error, of course, that is to be feared, but not just or even especially in regards to medical matters. Life is dangerous. Life is full of decisions, political decisions, economic decisions, social decisions. We make decisions as we're driving down the road. We make decisions about all sorts of things all the time, any one of which could be legal for ourselves or for others. We cannot walk away from a view of health that requires people to make decisions simply because people are capable of making wrong decisions. Inevitably, mistakes regarding instrumental value will be made. All sorts of mistakes with life and death implications are currently being made in all sorts of areas and will continue to be made. Such is the nature of our existence. We are required to make decisions, and we savor the results of our good decisions, and we suffer the consequences of our bad decisions. As for who will decide, who will be in control, the answer must be all of us in one way or another. We are dependent upon each other. Our lives overlap and interpenetrate. The decisions that must be made that affect all of us must be made by all of us, democratically or by elected representatives. Our healthcare decisions must be made along the same lines that we make decisions about our environment, our education, our foreign policy, and the like. For all these decisions are decisions about life and death. Let me depart here for a second from my prepared lecture. I think, in general, we tend to identify medical issues and health issues as life or death issues in a way that they don't really deserve that special distinction. Certainly, the decisions we make about our environment are life and death sorts of issues. The political decisions that we make are life and death sorts of issues. To a less dramatic sense, the decisions we make about education are very important decisions that may affect the life of people very profoundly. I think that we have tended to give the medical profession, or the field of medicine, too much territory, that we're making life and death decisions in all areas all the time. The time has come for me to include God in this talk. Including God in the discussion allows me to say a few new things and to put what I've already said in a larger context. When we think of instrumental value without including God, we necessarily think in human terms. What use is something or someone to me, and what use is something or someone to some other person or group of people? When we include God, we must also ask questions such as, what use am I to God? Or what use is someone else to God? God becomes the universal referent. Whereas I only make a difference to some, and am only affected by some, and so with everyone excluding God, God makes a difference to everyone and is affected by everyone. Looking at things from God's perspective enables us to break out of narrow self-interestedness, our somewhat less narrow nationalism, and our still less narrow anthropocentrism. I'll explain what I mean. We tend to place ourselves and our needs above the needs of others. This is fortunately not universally true. Some people are able to transcend themselves to a considerable degree, but most of us find this difficult. If we have AIDS or Alzheimer's disease or multiple sclerosis, then this is the disease we feel needs the most research. This is true even if the disease is relatively rare. From a self-interested perspective, the disease that we're most concerned about is the disease that we have or are likely to get. God takes, I think, a wider view of things. God values all life, especially human life, and therefore is most troubled by those diseases or afflictions that really do affect most people. God is not indifferent to our plight should we contract a relatively rare disease. God suffers with all who suffer. But whereas our empathy for others is limited, God's empathy is perfect, and hence God's concern has an objectivity that ours lack. When we think about God, we're forced to widen the parameters of our thought. We who are fortunate enough to live in luxury need to remember the hundreds of millions of those who are not so blessed. At the same time that we in this country are perfecting organ transplants and the implantation of artificial organs and cloning antibodies and using magnetic resonance scanners, procedures that cost billions and billions of dollars annually, millions of human beings go blind for lack of proper vitamins and die of simple bacterial infections for lack of antibiotics. It is perhaps natural for us to think of health in national terms, the diseases that affect those in our nation. We're not thinking in even more limited terms about the diseases that affect people in our age group or in our race or in our family. But we can be sure that God does not think in these limited terms. The same $10,000 that goes to pay for a single open heart operation, or the $240,000 that goes to pay for a single liver transplant, could bring good health to hundreds or perhaps thousands of people who live in less developed countries. How does one defend saving the life of one person rather than the lives of hundreds? Including God in our thinking about health requires us to expand our health concerns. There's an additional issue I feel I must raise, but one which I don't tend to spend any time on at all, hardly, is anthropocentrism, our unique preoccupation with ourselves. The word health for many of us is synonymous with human health. Of course, other living things can be healthy or not healthy, but when we're speaking of health, most of us assume that human health is what's being discussed. Again, I think God takes a wider perspective. God is especially interested in human health, but I don't believe that God's exclusively interested in human health. Once again, thinking about God forces us to widen our perspective. My point in this section is that healthcare, especially the healthcare advances and trends in this country, needs to be seen in a larger perspective, what I'm calling God's perspective. We are understandably accustomed to looking at things from our perspective, what's best for me, or in a national term, what's best for our country. But God's perspective, God's concern about healthcare issues are much wider. God is concerned for all. Including God in the discussion also allows me to make two additional points. We need not take our death so seriously, and we ought not to place such a premium on good health. These are two very important underlying premises of modern medicine, that the death is something that is awful, and that anything that we can do to prevent it should be done. And the other premise is that good health is so clearly desirable in itself that anything that can be done to promote good health should be done. I think that when you include God in the discussion, one has to conclude that death is not such a serious matter. I'm not saying it's not serious, I'm just saying it's not all that serious, and that there are other things of great value besides good health. If who we are and what we do matter to God, then each of us makes an everlasting difference. We will never be forgotten, and whatever we accomplish will always be fully recognized by God. This fact puts the tragedy that is death in perspective. Sooner or later, each of us must die. Many would prefer later rather than sooner, But whenever we die, our lives counted for something and always will. Secular humanism invariably overemphasizes life because apart from life, human life, there's nothing. Modern medicine and modern society as a whole has begun to adopt this outlook and hence to view modern medicine as that which stands between us and utter meaninglessness, us and death. When we adopt the perspective that includes God, however, we can't equate our own death with meaninglessness, or even the death of our society. The world was replete with purposes before we existed, and will be rich with meaning when we are dead. And the value that we contributed to God during our lifetime will abide with God forever. We need not take our own deaths and the deaths of those we love so seriously. Likewise, I think we need not take our own health so seriously. Because of our technical capabilities and the trend towards specialization, focusing on the part rather than the whole, we tend to overlook the fact that many outstanding contributions to human life and the divine life do not require good health. My point is not that we should shun good health or that we should not do certain basic or reasonable things to promote good health, but only that we need to put health into a larger perspective. Health is not the prerequisite for meaningful and lasting contributions. Many people live long, healthy lives and contribute relatively little to others and to God, while others live short lives plagued with ill health and contribute a great deal. At the beginning of this lecture, I alluded to some more practical health-related issues, namely how much of our private resources ought to be devoted to maintaining our health and how much of our national resources, both financial and intellectual, should be committed to public health, and when, if ever, is good health not desirable. I feel I have to address these somewhat here in the closing pages. Regarding the first two questions, I don't have any specific dollar amounts or percentages of income or GNP in mind, but my feeling is that we already spend too much. Not too much, perhaps, in respect to what we pay for entertainment or national defense and the other things we spend our money on. These areas of our lives also need to be reevaluated in a larger context, I think, one that takes the rest of the world and God into account. But too much in regards to what we get for our dollars. More health, more life could be purchased, if you will, if we spent less on modern high-tech medicine or healthcare. High-tech healthcare, wondrous achievement that it is siphoning off billions of dollars from life-saving low-tech healthcare and from education and from the arts and from all the other things that makes life worth living. As for the final question, when, if ever, is good health not desirable, the answer has to be that when more good can be achieved by our dying than by our continuing to live. We do not live in a world of infinite resources, nor do we live in a world where our actions do not affect others. We live instead in a world of finite quantities and of causal relations. All lives are valuable, not just our own, and sometimes the greatest good that's possible does not include our continued existence. Each of us needs to be committed not just to our own well-being, what's good for us, but to goodness itself. We need to learn to value life with a capital L and not just our own individual lives. I realize that my answers, if you can call them answers, to to these pressing problems are far too general to be made into public policy. But my objective this morning is not to suggest public policies, but rather to indicate the direction our thinking should take. I think that healthcare policies can and must be made. But I think it's important that the discussions which eventuate in specific policies are sufficiently broad in the beginning so as not to bias the conclusion. Healthcare issues are not simply technical matters, nor are they chiefly political and financial matters, and they ought not to be treated as such. Healthcare matters are primarily religious and philosophical matters, and they must be seen as such. Allow me to summarize then some of my main points and to make a few concluding remarks regarding meaning. Life is the ability to experience. Experience is both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable. The primary value of health is its instrumental value, not its intrinsic value. And instrumental value is a function of how much one can contribute to others and how profoundly. If this is largely the case, then our lives will be worthwhile to the extent that we can and do enrich the lives of others, all others. To the extent that our lives are private, narrowly self-interested, to the extent we attempt to solve our problems while ignoring the problems of others, to the extent that we use our resources, both material and intellectual, to further our ends, our lives will be less worthwhile, less significant than they otherwise would be. On some level, most of us recognize this to be the case. The old miser or the self-absorbed celebrity is not commonly regarded as the prize example of meaningful human existence. It is the people who gave of themselves to others, whether they were rich or poor, talented or untalented, healthy or ill, whose lives seem to us to be and to have been worthwhile. It is service to others that makes our life meaningful. I've also suggested an additional dimension to contributing values to others, the ultimate type perhaps, and that's the value we contribute to God. This is the only value that is truly enduring, for only God endures forever. Of course, God takes pleasure in our good health, and for that reason, good health is always of some enduring value. But God also takes pleasure in our intellectual life, and in our social lives, in our artistic accomplishments, and in our service to other human beings, and in our service to non-human beings, indeed in all things that are good. Good health is only one of countless goods. It is not the ultimate good, nor are all other goods predicated upon it. Our society, I believe, places altogether too much value on good health, especially our good health, and hence has placed too little value on the good health of others and on all the other goods that are possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for a most insightful and thought-provoking talk. At 11 o'clock, he will be convening over in the Bonner Room for any of you who would like to continue to discuss with him some of the points that he made. Some of them I thought were quite startling. And we also have a few minutes if any of you would like to ask questions. I'm sure Dr. Ford would be happy to answer.
an unbiased book. I can't think of a good argument to recommend. If I think of it all, I'm the question is, how did I arrive at my conclusion that instrumental value takes precedence over intrinsic value? I guess through reflection, I can tell you my reasoning. I think that intrinsic value is fleeting. That instrumental value is the value you contribute to others, and so it's perpetuated. And what I'm calling the ultimate type of instrumental value is the value you contribute to God, so then it would be permanent. So in large part, I think it's a function of endurance, that the instrumental value is the value that endures, whereas intrinsic value is fleeting. There's also a difference in terms of sort of private public, that intrinsic value is a very private sort of thing, and instrumental value is very public. And, I think that if you can contribute value to many, many people, or instrumentally valuable to many, many people, then you have created more value than the sort of intrinsic value that you might be able to enjoy in your own private life. Yes, not really literaturely germane to this. I'm putting together a collection of essays on postmodern medicine, or the movement in medicine, and I'll have an essay in there and some general remarks and things. I don't know if it should be out by the end of the year or something. I'm sorry. I guess through bookstores and things. It's not the sort of the University of America Press is going to publish it. Those aren't the sort of presses that have wide distributions and things. You might have to order it or something, but it's not destined to be a bestseller or something. It's not going to be everywhere. Yeah. I would say yes, but of a very minimal sort. It seems that you can increase the value you have for God by contributing values to others, because they too will contribute their value to God, so that the more it's not purely a matter of numbers, that if you can make a profound influence on relatively few people, that's oftentimes more significant than making a very superficial contribution to many people. But by and large, one way to increase your significance in God's eyes would be to contribute value to other human beings and non-humans. Yeah, I would think that she has contribute a lot of value to God.
I don't hear that you're saying intrinsic value feedback to
Yeah. Yes, I think that if you take an instrumentalist sort of approach to health in our, what I would call humanistically oriented, secular humanistically oriented, then it becomes very dangerous. But I think that if you recognize God's existence, then you can look at things from an instrumental perspective with that added dimension, and it no longer becomes any more frightening than the rest of existence. Yeah.
Let me get to the point where you can look at healthcare from God's perspective when it's a member of your own family or a child or
Yeah.
a spouse. They choose between a high-tech care and death. You don't have to really deal with that on the God's perspective.
I was thinking of that, and it's very hard. I mean, there's people I love very dearly, and would, I think, be willing to do almost anything, no matter how much it cost, no matter who it hurt, to see that these people got every possible, advantage. But I think that that's unfortunate, and I hope that I wouldn't be ruthless in that. I think that we're in a somewhat difficult transitionary stage because we do have all this high-tech options available to us, and so there's this great temptation to use what we have. But I think that perhaps we need to think about whether or not we should continue developing more and more sophisticated sorts of technologies, or use those dollars and the intellectual effort to go into those things for other things that are valuable. I appreciate your question. I mean, I know the dilemma that put you in, or put me in, or put anyone in. But I think in principle, we have to get outside of what's best for us, or what's best for our child, or what's best for our spouse or something, and try to look at what's best for everyone, or what's best, all things considered.
What are intrinsic values meant through accomplishment of the instrumental values?
I'm not really sure what you're asking.
Your importance is stressed on instrumental values, broader perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. In accomplishing that, wouldn't our intrinsic values be automatically met?
I think there's a much more involved and complicated relationship between intrinsic and instrumental values than I was able to develop here. I think that as we become more instrumentally valuable to others, our lives become more intrinsically valuable. That these things work back and forth. That I can't imagine. Yeah, I would think that someone who recognized that they were absolutely of no value to anyone would have an awful existence. I mean, I don't see how you could have much value in your own life if absolutely nobody was better off for your existence.